My name is Kyle Drew, and this is my presentation for the final exam of this course. In this presentation, I am going to be attempting to answer the question of who were the Victorians. In order to do so, I am going to be taking a look back at the novels that we studied this semester and taking a close look at the characters in these novels. By studying what these characters value, what is important to them, the rules that govern how they live, and who and how they interact with one another and the world around them, we can see a reflection of the values of Victorian society and the authors who wrote these characters. Throughout the novels that we studied this semester, I've noticed four major themes that have been present in nearly everything that we read, and that is structure, education, travel, and gender roles. Structure is simply referring to a set of guidelines or a set of social norms that these characters are living by, and that is going to give us insight to how the Victorians lived. Education is something that has had a lot of emphasis in many of the works that we studied this semester, and that'll also give us insight to just how important education was to the Victorian people and what it meant to them. The same goes for travel, where we see travel as almost as its own form of education, where leaving the comfort of where these characters are from and leaving their structure and going out into the world and educating themselves on other cultures and other societies, we see these characters improve. And last but not least, we have the gender roles, and we'll see some characters in these works are going to rebel against these gender roles, while some of them are going to fully embrace them and even attempt to enforce them on other characters. So for structure, I have, as I said, it's really referencing the tradition and roles of societies. We see this a lot in Cranford, where we have Miss Jenkins, who has essentially set the norms for the society. We see the rules of, living essentially, well, with just the essentials. We don't see the women of Cranford splurging on anything that they don't need. It's almost looked down on as being gluttonous to have more than what you need. Similarly, with structure, we see a lot of guidance in what is happening. There's a lot of planning. Everything is well thought out. This is another thing that you can see very clearly in Cranford with the get-togethers that the women of Cranford often have, where they have planned it all ahead of time. Nothing is spontaneous. Everything is prepared and decorated beforehand. The women get dressed up and then they have their times, their invitations are sent out and everything. There's a lot of structure to how they live their life. But this is the structure aspect kind of ties into the travel, which we'll get to in just a moment. Um, because we are going to talk about education before that. So, education is seen as a way to improve one's social standing. It's a path to a better life. The more educated you are, the more access you have to resources, therefore, the more money that you must have. Um, as a result of this, you see different forms of entertainment for different levels of education. I have a little note here saying they're referencing the hard times portion where the speaker is at a school and they are placing an extremely large amount of emphasis on facts while addressing the school children. On the way home, the speaker sees his children watching the circus through a fence and becomes infuriated with them because he believes that they are far too educated to receive any form of enjoyment from something like the circus. The circus is unfit for educated people. But this ties into the travel, just like the structure. So the travel is going to lead to new experiences, new cultures, new people, new areas. It's a way for the characters to escape the cycles of the ones that come before them. We see this a lot in well, it's present in Cranford. Um, where we have an outside viewpoint from Mary Smith, who is the narrator. She is coming back to visit Cranford once in a while. She's giving us that outside look into the structure of it. But we get that outside look because she was daring enough to travel away from Cranford in the first place. We also see this in the piece by Charles Darwin, where he is out exploring with the local people, and he's exploring new areas and writing about all of the wildlife and the plant life that he sees. The travel aspect is a form of education in and of itself, where the experiences are opening the minds of the characters to new ideas and new ways of life. And last but not least, we have our gender roles. Earlier in the presentation, I mentioned how some characters seem to enforce the roles while some characters seem to rebel against them. So for enforcing the gender roles, I have Miss Jenkins down. As I said earlier, she kind of sets the norms of Cranford. She has determined that the rules they have in place are rules that need to be obeyed. Otherwise, the characters risk being essentially banned from Cranford, socially, if not physically. On the flip side, we have a couple characters in Cranford who are willing to go against the social norms. So we have Mary Smith, who is, as I said, she is an outside viewpoint looking into the structure and the norms of Cranford. As she spends more time outside, we get a more and more um, robust look at just how just how heavily enforced the gender roles are inside of Cranford, especially when it comes to the tea parties. We see a lot of the women in Cranford are all enjoying many of the same things that are typically seen as feminine. So you have your baking, you have your knitting, activities like that, which are seen as traditionally more feminine, are taken up by many of the women in Cranford. However, we also have Miss Maddie, who is Miss Jenkins' sister. Miss Maddie is less of a rebel and more of a character kind of caught in the middle, where she isn't quite sure if she wants to follow the gender roles or not. Miss Maddie is a character who follows her sister Miss Deborah Jenkins, because Miss Jenkins has set those norms. She is a source of structure for Miss Maddie that Miss Maddie can use to kind of guide her own life. And we see after Miss Deborah Jenkins passes away, we see Miss Maddie kind of shift where she has to discover who she is, for herself versus letting her sister determine how she lives her life. To tie this all together, I wanted to go back to the discussion board where we read through the Dickens Journal online. The edition that I chose was for the 10th of June in 1854, and what I did here was I listed each of the articles that was posted in that edition of the Dickens Journal, and the for each article I assigned one of those four major themes to it. So for the Hard Times piece that was published that particular week, excuse me, we have structure. So the Hard Times piece is about Stephen Blackpool, who is essentially shunned from his peers for refusing to go against the structure that is present in their particular society. The British Phenomena article is telling several stories about several characters who are once again outside of the society that we're looking at. This is what gives it that aspect of travel and education about the outside world, where we get to see more of more of the world than just what that character knows. We have outside perspectives coming in and educating about the world around us, and it's a form of travel through education. The waste article is another one that is about education, obviously. The author of this one describes many solutions to the waste that is being produced, and the goal of this particular article is to raise awareness and education about the issue of waste in the country. Then we have, following that, The Sailor. That one is another one that I decided would fit the theme of travel more than anything. It's describing the life of a sailor, which is something that um, many people who were reading this wouldn't have much knowledge about. And so, once again, this is sort of tying in both travel and education, where we are traveling outside of what we know by means of being educated about something else. And then we have The Little Flower, which is a story about an escaped slave girl who is she falls in love and she travels around with this guy, and they have different run-ins with the law. Um, this is obviously dealing a lot with travel more than anything else. This seems to be one of those that is more geared towards entertainment more than anything else. But there are certainly many themes and lessons to be learned from this article. Following that, we have the article Chip, a Lesson in Multiplication, which is kind of similar to the Waste article, where the goal here is education about the multiplication of human population rather than the waste. Um, the author of this particular article is writing about excess space, um, the food supply, how it will, in theory, multiply in proportion to the population, and so on, so on. The focus of it is education about the increase in population and what that means for the human race. Following that, we have the Death's Door article, which I decided would fit the education theme more than anything else. So this one is a little bit backwards in the sense that it is indirectly describing the lack of education that is attributed with poverty, which is what the main character in this sees. There is an insane amount of poverty abounding, that there is death all around him, and it is because of the lack of education and the lack of resources that these people are finding themselves in these stages of poverty where they cannot pull themselves out of it. And finally, we have The Roving Englishman, Greek Waters. This one is another one that I decided would fit education most, but it could also fit the travel theme as well. So this one, the author is describing the benefits of hot springs located in several different locations in an attempt to make people aware of the benefits of them, as well as perhaps get them to travel around to them. That way, the people who decide to travel around are able to get those new experiences, and as a result, be just slightly more educated. So, with all that in mind, to answer the question, who were the Victorians? It's a lot more complicated than they were human, but they can't really be summed up in just one or two sentences. They were educated travelers who strived to learn the mysteries of the world while upholding their own ideas of structure and their roles in society. Put plain and simply, they were human, just like us.